and silence through the night. What a thrill.
If you watched my review of Metal Gear Solid 2, or have played the game at all, you'll know that one of its main themes is subverting of expectations. Switching from mainstay series protagonist Solid Snake to the then unknown Raiden was one of the biggest shocks in video game history, with all the trailers leading up to its release back in 2001 featuring Solid Snake on the tanker. So when gamers found themselves playing the majority of the game with a new babyface rookie on a waste plant in the middle of the ocean, it made for an unexpected, jarring experience. However, while the protagonist and setting were completely changed, the foundational gameplay and presentation were copied directly from the first Metal Gear Solid game, just updated for the 6th generation of consoles. So while the lead and location were completely flipped, the fundamental gameplay and mechanics were extremely familiar to anyone who had played Metal Gear Solid 1. Metal Gear Solid 3, released in 2004, subverted expectations, but in the opposite way. Snake, the familiar face from the original game, was back in all his grizzled charm and glory, and players were more than happy to walk in his stealthy, murderous shoes once again. However, this time, it was everything around Snake that was now unfamiliar. Instead of taking place in the near future like all previous games, Snake Eater takes place in 1964. Gone were the sleek, modern surroundings of Shadow Moses, the tanker and the plant, replaced by the jungles of Soviet Russia. The electronic millennial scoring of its predecessors were also gone, replaced by tense, jungle-inspired compositions, orchestrated scores to accompany intense gunfights, and a theme song ripped unapologetically, but very much in tribute, from the old James Bond movies. A genre from which the game draws heavily from in every asset, including setting, gameplay, character development, plot, and indeed, musical score. Helping to create what is the most original, streamlined, and, in many ways, simply playable Metal Gear Solid ever. As I mentioned, the game is set in 1964, right in the middle of the Cold War. You play as Naked Snake, a man who is physically and hourly identical to Solid Snake. Series veterans would have figured out who this doppelganger was almost immediately, although I'm ashamed to admit it took me about 2/3 of my way through the game to figure it out. I mean, I was 13 and perhaps a little slow, so give me a break. That being said, I'll get to his identity at the end of the video, but just a heads up, this review is going to contain spoilers, so if you haven't played this game yet, I suggest you stop watching this video and play it, especially in the wake of the upcoming remake, Metal Gear Solid 3 Delta. The game opens up with Snake sitting in an aircraft, smoking a cigar nonchalantly. This is the moment that all Raiden haters let out a collective exhale incidentally. He is about to complete the first ever halo jump in history, a skydiving technique where you jump from a higher than usual altitude and deploy your parachute lower than a typical skydive. The first halo jump actually took place in 1970 by an American recon team during the Vietnam War. Now the reason I'm spending so much time on this is because it is the first instance of a very important recurring theme in the plot of Metal Gear Solid 3. In previous games, Hideo Kojima, the creator, writer, director, and father of the Metal Gear series, had the advantage of a near-futuristic setting when writing the story, meaning he could create his own vision of the world to suit his narrative without contradiction because, well, we hadn't reached that point in history yet. For example, in the Metal Gear timeline, George Sears, aka Solid as Snake, was the President of the United States in the late 2000s because, well, in 2001, we didn't know who the President of the US would be at that time. The point being is that Kojima had the luxury of the unknown to craft a fictional timeline and narrative that was still based in the real world. However, in this prequel, he already had 40 years of established American and global history to navigate around. This was the beginning of Metal Gear's alternative historical timeline, where Kojima had to rewrite history without directly contradicting it. As we will see, he uses the idea of covert operations and black operations a lot as a loophole to get around this, but considering the historical bind he's in, it's pretty much his only avenue. The Halo jump sets off the beginning of a covert operation called the Virtuous Mission, where Snake is tasked with rescuing a Soviet scientist named Nikolai Sokolov, who's working on a powerful Russian weapon called the Shagohod. Sokolov initially fled the US but was extradited back to the Soviet Union soon after. Why? To prevent the Cuban Missile Crisis. The original story that you and I would have read, in a nutshell, is that the Cuban Missile Crisis ended when Russia agreed to pull their nuclear missiles out of Cuba while the US pulled theirs from Turkey and agreed not to invade Cuba. In the Metal Gear timeline, Sokolov's extradition was the main demand on the Russian side, so he and his ingenious scientific mind could continue developing this new weapon, and that the US were going to get rid of their Turkish missiles anyway, as they had no strategic value. Of course, when you say it out loud like that, it sounds ridiculous, but in the context of the Metal Gear series, where singular heroics are commonplace, it just about adds up. It's also kind of cool that the story subtly rewrites genuine history to fit its own narrative. It's like a secret alternative history that we as gamers are let in on. Also, if he succeeds, he and his unit, Foxhound, led by Major Zero, will be made an official group by the CIA. Upon landing in the jungle, Snake receives a codec call from Major Zero, re-establishing his mission objective. He is also introduced to a support team, paramedic, Sigint, a weapons expert, and, surprisingly, the boss. The boss was Snake's mentor, who spent a decade training and moulding him. Immediately, we can hear the reverence Snake has for her in his voice. The boss reminds Snake of his ability to use his CQC, close quarters combat, a fighting system which is a blend of striking, judo, and knife fighting. More pressingly, she gives him a lecture of how in war, allies and enemies change with the times, a case of somewhat obvious foreshadowing which also serves as an important narrative theme later on in the story. As characters, Zero, Paramedic, and Sigint are serviceable. Zero in particular is charming, with his Oxford British accent and James Bond obsession fitting in well with the general theme of the game. Paramedic is kind and endearing, while Sigint has a smooth quality about him. The only major issue with these characters is that they're just sort of forgettable. Throughout my playthrough, I don't think I contacted any of them myself, except occasionally when I called Paramedic to save the game. Whereas many of the characters you communicated with via codec in the previous two games felt essential to the story, characters like the Colonel, Otagon, Naomi, Rose, and Snake himself, these three characters can basically fade into the background entirely if you choose to allow them to. After dispatching of a number of enemies, Snake makes his way to a shack where Sokolov is being held. While there, Sokolov explains in a nutshell what the Shagohod is, a ground-terrain vehicle capable of launching nuclear missiles. He goes on to say that Colonel Volgan, the head of the Russian GRU, is looking to acquire the weapon and overtake the USSR. Leaving the shack, we encounter a young Revolver Ocelot, who was the leader of a small crew called the Ocelot Unit. Ocelot was one of the key characters in the previous two games, and will go on to remain one of the series' most vital players in later installments also. While Ocelot is presented as an old, cunning, wily veteran in MGS 1 and 2, this is a young and relatively green version of the character here, whose poise is often overtaken by anger and emotion. If you played the previous games prior to this, it was cool, if a little strange, to see this iteration of Ocelot. During this cutscene, after a little preamble, Snake uses his CQC to knock him and his entire Ocelot unit unconscious. This is the first of dozens of similar cutscenes which showed that Konami were really looking to push the boundaries of video game cinematography to the limit. They set a precedent in MGS2, but they really went above and beyond in this game. Seriously, for the time, the cutscenes in this game were just incredible. The camera work and choreography were groundbreaking for the time and still hold up 20 years later, but we'll expand on this a little later on. This leads to another two cutscenes. The first one takes place on a bridge overhanging a river, where Snake and Sokolov are ambushed by the boss, who is carrying two small nuclear warheads. She tells Snake that she is defecting from the United States to the Soviet Union and rejoining her crew, the Cobra unit. Behind her is the main antagonist, Colonel Volgan, a large, sociopathic and somewhat camp man who literally has electricity running through his veins. Above them in a helicopter are the foot soldiers of the Cobra unit. The Pain, a fat man with bees running through his veins, presumably along with a large amount of cholesterol. The End, an old man with protruding eyeballs. The Fury, a pyromaniac astronaut. And the Fear, a half man, half arachnid who snatches Sokolov and drags him onto the helicopter. Now, to be fair, these characters are bizarre even by the standards of the previous game's Foxhound and Dead Cell units, but the encounters later on will make up for their ostentatious eccentricities. At the behest of Volgan, the boss tosses Snake off the bridge, plummeting a distance that would kill any man. He survives, of course, and is laying half dead at the side of the river. Flying above, Volgan grabs one of the nuclear warheads and launches it at the research facility that had been developing the Shagohod, having already acquired the weapon, and blows it to Kingdom Come. Meanwhile, Snake is still beached on the side of the river like a well-toned mutilated whale and must heal his wounds. It's at this point that I'd like to talk about the healing, feeding and camouflage systems in Metal Gear Solid 3, which I'm collectively going to refer to as the game's survival mechanics. These are the three most prominent new features in MGS3. In previous games, if you got hurt, you either died or simply took a ration to immediately replenish your health. You never lost stamina no matter how prolonged a gameplay session was, and stealth, while the most important gameplay element, or at least the most highly promoted, was never a matter of blending into your environment, but was simply about pure evasion. In MGS3, if you get hurt, you can heal your wounds. Get shot, you can remove the bullet and disinfect the wound. Get burned, you must apply ointment and cover the burn. Break a bone, bandage it up and put a splint on it, etc, etc. Now, to be fair, if you ignore the wounds, they will heal naturally, but addressing them immediately will heal them immediately, poison notwithstanding, as this will continue to drain your health and stamina. What will not go away by itself, however, is low stamina. And that's where eating comes in. After a prolonged period, Snake's stamina bar will go down, which will in turn slow him down, affecting his aiming stability and causing his stomach to rumble, which can attract the attention of enemies. Playing off the game's title Snake Eater, Snake must kill and capture wild animals such as alligators, rabbits, fish, and indeed snakes to eat to replenish his stamina. And again, unlike his ability to heal himself, feeding yourself is essential. What is also essential is effective camouflage. In keeping with the 1960s setting, you no longer have a modern radar map that shows enemy locations dotted on it at all times for guidance. On top of that, the vast majority of the game takes place in the jungles and forests of Russia, making the soldiers much more difficult to spot. Not just because they themselves are dressed in army camo, but also because your view is often obstructed by the natural environment. Therefore, simple evasion is not the most viable form of stealth anymore, because you don't often know where the enemy is. Some of the most tense moments of the game are when you're trying to sneak through an area, and you hear a huh or is something there from an enemy guard, but you have no idea where he is. So therefore, camouflage is the most effective way to stay undetected. As you may have gathered, these survival mechanics slow down the pace of the game significantly, and the camo system is the most egregious mechanic in this regard. Whereas in previous games, you mostly strolled through areas, hiding behind walls or under boxes for a few seconds before running past guards, all while keeping your eye on that radar. This time, you're frequently hopping in and out of menus, changing your camo to adapt to different environments. In fact, it isn't uncommon to change your camo half a dozen times in one area of the game to stay sufficiently hidden. Moving from grass to moss, from moss to leaf bedding, from leaf bedding to, well, you get the idea. This is still one of the most divisive features in the game. On the one hand, many lauded the innovative and nuanced system, saying it added to the stealthy immersion. Others lamented it for interrupting the flow of the game, slowing it down unnecessarily. Now, while I can see the latter's point of view, and in fact Kojima and his team would introduce a much more fluid and impressive camo system in Metal Gear Solid 4, but that's a topic for another video. I happen to like it. Whereas MGS 1 and 2 were about urban evasion using modern technology, MGS 3 is about pure survival, using relatively antiquated tools to navigate the terrain. I mean, you literally have to hunt and eat your own food to stay alive, so in that sense, it fits. I think the camo system not only makes sense within the context of the game, but adds significantly to the immersion and overall enjoyment of it. It really emphasises the idea that you are alone and against the elements, and while it makes for a slower experience, it makes it far more intense. Plus, there are moments in the game where you get a break from the jungle crawling, which balances the gameplay out and stops it becoming too monotonous. Speaking of tension, this is easily the most intense Metal Gear game. In certain areas, especially at the beginning of the game, it can be genuinely difficult to see where the enemies are, and they often spot you before you spot them. The alert, evasion and caution phases are also significantly longer this time, often lasting minutes, increasing both the tension and that sense of slower pacing. The music in this game is also simply outstanding. Composed once again by Harry Gregson Williams and Norihiko Hibino, the soundtrack really enhances the experience. Crawling through the jungles with the guards on high alert, the music pulses with dull percussion, high-pitched woodwinds and low, plodding guitar riffs. In the heat of battle, the duo make full use of the orchestra, which flourishes in dramatic fashion as the bullets fly. The game's theme song, composed alone by Hibino, is now one of the most iconic in gaming. While I said in jest that the song is a rip-off of the 007 theme, it's really more of a flattering homage and, aside from the general vibe, is actually very different compositionally from its inspiration, aside from the final chords at the very end of the song, which are a blatant rip-off. It also must be said that this is performed brilliantly by vocalist Cynthia Harrell. The sound design in general is amazing. The rustling of grass, the calling of animals, the sound of rain and the flowing riverbeds, to name but a few, are all brilliant. Again, I have to remind myself that this game is 20 years old, because the game is still tremendous hourly. David Hayter returns to give Snake his iconic voice, and he turns in a brilliant performance. Major Zero and Eva are two other particular highlights, with both oozing charm and maintaining conversational flow. Even the less overwhelming performances, like the boss, are serviceable. I hate to pick on her character, but her performance can feel a little flat at times. Maybe it's because, even 20 years later, I still can't disassociate from the fact that a childhood friend of mine pointed out that she is the same voice actress who played Diane Simmons in Family Guy. The bastard. Hospital bound after the failed Virtuous mission, Snake is informed by Zero that Khrushchev has been in contact with President Johnson regarding the nuking of the research facility. Having detected the presence of an American aircraft, that being Foxhounds, on the same day, he is accusing the US of being involved in the attack and is threatening nuclear war unless the country can prove its innocence. In order to do that, Snake must kill Volgan and his faction and destroy the Shagohod. He has one more objective though. President Johnson informed Khrushchev that the boss has defected to the USSR. Khrushchev, of course, knows who she is, calling her the mother of the US Special Forces, while Johnson declares that she was the main factor in America's success at Normandy and, indeed, the war as a whole. Remember what I said about Kojima taking creative liberties with established history? So, to fully prove the United States' innocence, Snake must kill the boss, his mentor. A week later, Snake is dropped back into the jungles of Russia. His first objective is to rendezvous with Adam and Eva, the two NSA codebreakers who defected from the US to the Soviet Union. Along the way, he encounters the boss, who beats his ass again and asks him where his loyalties lie, to her or to his country and his mission. Snake, on the ground, asks her why she defected, to which she says that she didn't, and that Snake would learn the truth eventually. Again, more foreshadowing which we'll get to later. This is actually a touching scene and really emphasises their student-master relationship. It's a credit to the writing, cinematography and, indeed, performances that after only a quick prelude, the game manages to establish enough of a backstory between these two characters that it makes this moment affecting it all, even if the boss's defection story arc feels a little rushed. Anyway, Snake makes his way to Eva, who was holed up in the same shack that Sokolov was. Atop a motorcycle, she takes out a few guards before introducing herself to Snake who, like the stoic trained killer that he is more interested in her chest. Eva is immediately set up as a love interest for Snake, even though he rejects her advances at first. She speaks to him with flirtatious tones and even asks if he's been sent to tempt her in reference to the story of the Garden of Eden. She gives him a new handgun and tells him where Sokolov is being held, before insisting he get some rest while she keeps watch. Again, we're not sure if we can trust her, in keeping with the theme of espionage, but he obliges and goes to sleep. Eva is charming, much like Snake himself, and well suited to the role of suspicious ally/love interest. Snake in this scene is, predictably, great, especially when he's gushing over the gun Eva gave him, flaunting his expertise in weapons knowledge. However, this section as a whole is where my first real gripe with the game comes in, and it has nothing to do with gameplay or plot. One of the best moments in Metal Gear Solid 2, and this series as a whole, is the tanker incident, a mission that serves as a prologue to the main game. What makes the tanker so great, aside from the mood, storytelling, innovative gameplay and just general enjoyability, is how it contrasts with the rest of the game. It just has a completely different feeling and dynamic than the plant section. In fact, it's almost more enjoyable when replaying the game, because you already know how the game is just going to switch it up on you. Basically, it feels special. It's also reasonably long and can take anywhere from 1 to 3 hours to complete the first time around. Now, the Virtuous mission itself cannot hold a candle to the tanker incident, but is by no means bad. In fact, it's perfectly fine, and serves as a great way to establish the plot and introduce the game's mechanics. The problem is the beginning of the main game, Operation Snake Eater. At the beginning of Snake Eater, you're forced to traverse almost the exact same path to get to Eva as you did to Sokolov, with the only real difference being that it's at night. Not only is this tedious, it just feels completely unnecessary. The game takes place in the vast jungles of Russia, meaning it doesn't have to have the same architectural rigidity as Shadow Moses in MGS1 or the two locations in MGS2. They could have easily had you forge a different path to Eva, or, more desirably, had met Eva at a different location. It's the jungle, and because of this, there's no solid point of reference geographically that would force the developers to make you go to the same locations. My only guess is that Kojima did this on purpose as some sort of narrative device, like starting anew a second time to successfully complete your mission this time around. Or maybe it was an issue with disk space on the PS2's hardware, but somehow I doubt that. Either way, I feel like this is MGS3's biggest misstep, and it really messes up the pacing early on in what is an otherwise expertly paced game. However, the game makes up for this by immediately introducing its first major set piece. Waking in the morning, Snake is surrounded by the Ocelot unit, meaning you must eliminate them all. Now, you could just go out guns a-blazing, but thankfully the game encourages you to take them out stealthily by giving you very little firepower, a bed to hide under, and a crawl space to escape through. With the music pulsing, you're most likely either going to hide under the bed and take out the first attacker with your tranq gun, or you're going to go through the crawl space and methodically tranq each guard you come across gradually, granting you don't get caught. This is the first pure gameplay set piece in the game, and it's a lot of fun. The first Metal Gear game set the template for the gameplay, storytelling, and cinematography that the series would become famous for. The second game pushed the latter two to limits that were never seen before in the medium. But this, the third game, really matured in the gameplay department. Everything from set pieces to weaponry to its signature tactical espionage action. After defeating the Ocelot unit, Snake makes his way through a few more jungle areas, including a fort with some rations and a heavy machine gun, before he encounters Revolver Ocelot for the third time. A throwback to the duel Solid Snake had with the much older Ocelot in the third game, this time it takes place on a cliff edge with a chasm separating the two. As a fight, it's a pretty straightforward affair. Ocelot moves around in evasive patterns, taking cover behind trees and boulders, shooting at you behind cover or while on the move, while you fire back, trying to time his manoeuvres. Get the better of him for too long, and members of his unit, who are standing overhead, will fire at Snake, much to the chagrin of Ocelot. As a boss, it's serviceable if nothing spectacular. It's basically a straight shootout. Catching a mobile Ocelot is difficult enough, and predicting where from cover he's going to emerge from is a crapshoot. Also, getting yourself into position to get a good line of sight on him between the trees emphasises the more dynamic landscape from previous games, as does the fact that you pretty much have to shoot him from the first person perspective. The best time to catch him is when he's reloading, which is again another nice homage to the MGS1 fight. All in all, it's a good fight, but there are certainly better to come. Most importantly, it serves as a way to continue the rivalry between Snake and Ocelot, which grows in intensity and mutual respect with each encounter. When you defeat him, Snake, Ocelot and his men are attacked by a swarm of hornets, forcing you to dive into the chasm. Snake winds up in a dark cave which, after being in the forests and jungles, is quite a shock to the system, as you're almost completely submerged in darkness. The screen does eventually lighten up a little bit, which is a physical representation of Snake's eyes adjusting to the darkness, which is another nice touch, but it's a bit of a pain in the ass all the same. If you're lucky, you'll stumble across an old style fire torch, which makes the area more traversable. Once, or if, your surroundings become more visible, it's a fun little area to explore, containing a litany of crawl spaces, submerged caverns, and dynamic levels of higher and lower ground. The contrast between the cave and the flora and fauna of the jungles, both aesthetically and mechanically, also help with creating that excellent sense of pacing that permeates the entire game. There are also some cool items that are discoverable in the cave's various nooks and crannies, including a powerful M37 shotgun. Speaking of which, this would be a pertinent time to talk about the game's weaponry. Although naturally more primitive, given the time period, There's actually much more variety in MGS3 than in the previous two games, at least when it comes to conventional handheld weapons. There are multiple assault rifles, an SMG, an LMG, multiple handguns, including a Colt single-action army, 5 different grenades, a survival knife and rocket launcher, to name but a few. It sounds minor, but I remember thinking how cool it was to have the ability to wield something as basic as a shotgun, given that they were unavailable in MGS1 and MGS2, and is indicative of the advancements and expansions that Kojima and Konami were trying to incorporate in the gameplay department, along with everything else. Also, if you're lucky, you'll stumble across Ocelot's camouflage. In MGS2, if you defeat the bosses by non-lethal means, most likely the tranquilizer gun, you receive their dog tags, which you added to your collection of other dog tags obtained from soldiers, which unlocked stealth and unlimited ammo, assuming you acquired enough of them. The dog tags are gone this time, which is a shame because I really enjoyed collecting them. Maybe that's just my OCD kicking in. Instead, you receive a boss's camouflage when you dispose of them non-lethally. Each one has a unique pattern and a unique perk. In the case of Ocelot's animal pattern camo, it eliminates handshaking while aiming a weapon, regardless of your stamina. At the end of the cave, you encounter your next boss, making it 2 in quick succession. This boss, the Pain, is your first encounter with one of the Cobra unit, and is by far the worst boss in the game, both in terms of physical battle and the character himself. Every member of the Cobras, the boss notwithstanding, has some kind of supernatural power. Now this is not uncharted territory for the series, as the 2 previous games had Snake battling levitating psychics and literal vampires. Each of the Cobras have a moniker that's emblematic of the emotion that they carry into battle. In the Pain's case it's, well, Pain, which is fine. The only problem is that the Pain is such a poorly conceived character. He's basically a rotund soldier with a balaclava who has the ability to summon hornets, which he uses to shield himself, attack Snake and, bizarrely, summon weapons from thin air. The fight itself isn't much better, as Snake must swim between 2 rocky platforms in the middle of a deep bed of water to evade attacks and catch the Pain, who is positioned on a larger platform in the middle of the water with attacks of his own. In fairness, it's not god awful, but it just feels disjointed and awkward, and there are moments where you're just standing on a platform, gun drawn, waiting for the Pain, who's covered in bees and therefore somehow impenetrable, unless you lob smoke grenades at him, which run out almost immediately, to become vulnerable to attacks again. Things only get more ridiculous when halfway through the fight, the Pain starts shooting bullet bees at you from his mouth. Honestly, the best part of the fight was the laugh I got removing a bullet bee in the cure menu, which had been lodged in my face. The other issue with the Pain and, in fairness, many of the Cobras in general, is that they aren't given any room in the story as a whole to develop. A similar issue I had with Snake's Codex support team. One of the things that MGS1 did better than any game in the series was allow the player to get to know the Foxhound unit. By the time we had to fight them, not only were we familiar with them and their background, but we actually felt a connection to them, making disposing of them bittersweet at times. The problem with the Cobras is, we don't really care about them because we know nothing about them. It boggles my mind, especially given how great the boss fights in MGS3 are, how a creator like Kojima, who's so hyper-focused on storytelling, didn't feel it pertinent to flesh out these characters more. Granted, I understand that the boss, Vulcan and Ocelot are the main antagonists, and they do develop a nice arc as the game progresses. But it would have given these encounters much more weight if we knew more about the men I was murdering. After the fight, we emerge from the other side of the cave onto a rocky cliff top at sundown in what is honestly one of the most visually appealing moments in the game. The changing day cycles really add to the fluidity of the game's pacing, especially when contrasted to the relative staticity of previous games. Climbing down a steep pathway, we emerge into a shallow river with the setting sun reflecting upon us. Above, 3 manned hovercrafts are on patrol, so we shoot them, sending them crashing into the flora and fauna on either side in a ball of flame. Quick note, there are 2 entire areas, one in the jungle and one here in the riverbed, that are completely missable. This is a first for the series, which was always pretty much on the rails. It's not a huge deal and certainly isn't indicative of an open world by any means, but there are weapons and items that you can only acquire in these sections, and the fact that they exist in the first place gives MGS3 a little bit more sense of freedom and breathability. At the end of the riverbed, we come to the exterior of a warehouse at sundown, where we see an interaction between Volgan, Sokolov, Eva, who is working undercover for the KGB as Sokolov's wife, Ocelot, and the boss. Volgan electrocutes and assaults Eva when Sokolov doesn't comply with a soldier to enter the warehouse. Meanwhile, Ocelot shows up to test Sokolov's luck with a game of one-sided Russian roulette, before the boss shows up and puts an end to the horseplay, telling Ocelot that there's no such thing as luck on the battlefield. She tells Volgan that the pain is dead, but that Snake won't get past the fear or the end, both of whom reappear here, but whom we'll get to later. Everyone exits stage left, leaving the boss in the rain, once again speaking into the ether to this mysterious person named the Sorrow. The cutscene does a good job of establishing the interrelationships between these characters, showing what a scumbag Volgan is, and how vulnerable the boss is with regards to this Sorrow character, the emotion and mysteriousness of which creates intrigue for the player. After this, we make our way through the warehouse, which brings us to a heavily booby-trapped forest. The location is notable for one thing: the Tsunoku snake. Only located in this part of the game, this bizarre-looking snake can only be captured alive using the mousetrap. It can also take a long time to find, as you're very unlikely to capture it with the first set of traps. The reason you want to capture the Tsunoku in the first place is because if you keep it alive until the end of the game, you'll unlock unlimited ammo. This, of course, is such a random method of attaining unlimited ammo. If I had to guess, I'd say that Kojima must have made obtaining this, as well as other Easter eggs, more difficult on purpose to keep challenging his audience. What's more, there is a section later in the game where you have to recapture the snake after all your gear is taken away from you, and it's such an easily missable moment that I imagine most players without prior knowledge to this fact probably fail to reacquire it. Now you're probably asking, how do I acquire stealth camouflage? In MGS3 you only have two options. You can go through the entire game without getting spotted, or you can shoot 64 toy frogs, which are located in every single area of the game in random locations, including chase sequences where they can be very hard to hit, again emphasizing the increased difficulty in acquiring these perks. Once we've captured the snake, or not, it's not exactly mandatory, we come up to the Graniki Gorky lab. Surrounded by an electrical fence and a high wall, we must infiltrate the building. Once inside, you can don a scientist disguise in order to blend in to avoid suspicion. This, for me, is where the game really hits its stride. I mentioned earlier how the Virtuous mission was too similar to the beginning of Operation Snake Eater, making the latter feel tedious and repetitive. Well, somewhat ironically, one of the game's biggest strengths as a whole is the diversity of its environments. Whereas the main campaigns in MGS 1 and 2 are very cohesive and unchanging, at this stage in the game we've already left the lush jungles for the barren underground caves, to the scenic riverbeds at sundown, and now to the indoor setting of a laboratory at night. I've always loved this section because it completely changes the dynamic of the game. Rather than crawl through the tall grass, you have to navigate this multi-story laboratory in search of Sokolov while disguised as a scientist. This time, the guards won't pay you any mind, unless you act erratically or discard your disguise. And your biggest threats are the other scientists, who upon not recognizing you, will sound the alarm like the rats that they are. You can try to avoid them altogether, or risk snapping back into camouflage to take them out, or, upon obtaining them, knock them out using gas-filled cigarettes in a hilarious homage to old school spy flicks, more on which is to come. Basically, I just love how different the setting is. As I said before, Snake Eater does a great job in varying up the environments before they become stale. Reaching the main office, you do not find Sokolov, instead coming across Alexander Granin, a highly decorated Soviet scientist drowning his sorrows. He is doing so because Volgan chose to develop Sokolov Shagohod while rejecting his own blueprint for an advanced weapon, a kind of nuclear-armed bipedal walking battle tank, a Metal Gear, if you will. This is the very moment we're introduced to the father of the first Metal Gear prototype. Embittered and hammered, Granin tells Snake that he's going to give his prototype to his friend in the West, as the camera focuses on a picture of said friend. It's pretty obvious to anyone who's played the other games who this is, but just in case you haven't, I won't say specifically who it is, although his identity is about as secret as that of Naked Snake's. He also mentions something about a philosopher's legacy, but we'll get to that later. Unlike Sokolov, however, Granin has no intention of defecting from the Soviet Union, declaring his love for the motherland. Granin then tells Snake that he needs to go to Groznygrad, a military fortress which is housing both Sokolov and the Shagohod, before giving him a key that'll give him access to the deeper parts of the jungle through the warehouse from which he came. Why is he helping Snake? Because he complimented his shoes, which Eva had gifted him. I guess the old girl's been working her magic on all the fellas. I love this cutscene not just because of the historical Metal Gear centric significance of it, not just because it takes place in a contrasting environment, because of how well it establishes the era. The antiquated interior, the references to the Soviet Union, everything just feels so 1960s. However, we don't have time to dwell on this. We have to make our way back to the warehouse. On our way back through the booby trap forest, we encounter our second member of the Cobra unit, the Fear. Unlike the Pain, the Fear is actually a really good boss, both physically, conceptually, and in execution. A thin, greying man, the Fear shoots arrows dipped in venom from the Brazilian wandering spider at you from the treetops, which poison and disorientate you. With superhuman ability, stealth, and the ability to disjoint all his muscles, he hops from treetop to treetop like a jumping spider, shooting you with arrows at will. The encounter is enjoyable because, unlike the Pain, the character is well designed. He has a unique look and voice, and actually somewhat embodies the emotion he is trying to convey. Sure, his powers are silly, but so are everyone else's. Except this time in execution, it makes for a much more satisfying fight. Having to aim your gun at the treetops as the Fear whizzes by requires the use of your sight, sound, and your gear. The leaves falling from the trees is your visual cue, while the sound of him gliding through the air and landing will get louder or softer the closer or further away he is. As for the gear, if you're lucky enough to get your hands on some thermal goggles, well, it will make spotting him much easier. This is not only one of the most creative encounters, but is, in many ways, one of the more unpredictable, as it can be difficult to predict the Fear's movements which, especially when you consider his moniker, is definitely not a bad thing. If you decide to take him out with the tranquilizer gun which, like every other boss, will drain his stamina, he'll eventually get hungry and try to hunt animals in the woods to eat. If you fail to stop him from consuming one, he will regain all his stamina and you'll have to go through the same process all over again. I replayed MGS3 on hard difficulty and managed to beat him with the tranq gun on one attempt without him regaining his stamina. I was just lucky enough to pick a vantage point that was perfect for intercepting his movements, and fortuitously actually beat him with my very last bullet. What I like about this, aside from the convenience, is that I know if I play through it again, I'm very unlikely to pick a similarly advantageous vantage point and repeat the same success the second time around. Going through the warehouse, we come into the deepest jungle area yet. A mixture of high and low plains, tall trees and hollowed out logs, filled with booby traps and guards which are heard first and, hopefully, seen second. Be sure to enjoy these moments of jungle espionage because it'll be the last time you experience it for quite some time. But do not fret, my friend, because what comes next is truly special. Entering the area of Sokroveno South, Snake is confronted by the End, who is perched on a faraway cliff. He introduces himself aloud and pleads with the forest to grant him this final prey. I can say without hyperbole that the End is one of the greatest bosses in video game history, and the best one I have ever personally encountered. The End is a 100-year-old sniping expert whose camouflage gives him near stealth within the terrain of the forest. He takes on Snake in three areas: the aforementioned plateau, a river in Sokroveno West, and a clearing in Sokroveno North. When replaying MGS3, this was the moment I was most excited about revisiting. It's hard to fully explain the genius of this boss battle, but I'll give it my best shot. First of all, it is entirely unique among boss fights, the Metal Gear series included, in that there's a lot of inaction. Unless you're running around an area like an idiot, in which case the End is just going to pick you off, you spend much of the fight stealthily navigating the three areas of Sokroveno, trying to decipher his location, and hopefully shooting him with your sniper rifle before he spots you. And even if you run around one of these areas like a moron, the End might not even be there, and will instead be lying in wait patiently in one of the other two locations. On top of that, there is absolutely no music playing during this encounter, and I mean none. It's such a subversion of what a typical boss fight is that upon first playthrough, it's actually thrilling. In fact, from a pure gameplay perspective, this may be the single greatest moment in Metal Gear history. A game of pure cat and mouse between Snake, armed with a sniper rifle, and the End, a much more prolific and experienced sniper, with the Forest quite literally on his side. The End doesn't even try to kill Snake, another quirk in what is already a wholly unique boss fight. Instead, he shoots him with tranquilizer rounds. These drain Snake's stamina, affect his ability to aim his weapon, and cause a black ring to form around the screen, affecting the player's field of vision, mimicking the drowsing effect that the tranquilizer is having on Snake. If the player neglects to remove these bullets and replenish stamina, or take too many rounds in succession, Snake will pass out. If this happens, the End will pick him up and drop him off to the underground prison of Graniki Gorki. Yes, all the way back to Graniki Gorki, meaning you have to trek all the way back to Sokroveno to resume the fight. What's more, if the player saves mid-fight and then exits the game, when you reload the same save, it may trigger a cutscene of Snake sleeping mid-fight, leading to the same result. There are other Easter eggs that can occur during this fight, but I'll get to them in a minute. Obviously, the most conventional way to fight the End is via a straight-up sniper duel. The End has almost perfect camouflage, so the player has to be creative in tracking him down, because as I mentioned, merely running at him is not an option. The boss fight forces the player to utilise Snake's equipment and resources more than any other, including items the player may have neglected to use up until this point, and may never in fact use again. The thermal goggles can help you see the End's footprints and see his infrared thermography. The directional microphone can alert you to his general position by making his breathing audible, while your binoculars can magnify the reflection of a scope, giving away his position. When you successfully put a few rounds into him, he'll fall over, mutter a compliment, fire a flashbang and disappear. Well, when I say disappear, I mean run away at an inhuman speed. Again, almost every character in MGS3 has some silly supernatural element to them, and this is the End's. Well, that and he's photosynthetic. Seriously. Halfway through the fight, if the End's stamina and health is drained, he can call upon the sunlight of the forest to replenish both. It sounds silly when you say it like that and, well, it is. But in the context of the fight and the character, it works and, well, when the fight is this good, these absurdities can be forgiven. But this is still only scratching the surface. There are so many other layers and Easter eggs in this boss that it's actually a little ridiculous. Say for example you want to obtain the End's camo. Do you simply drain his stamina like the other bosses? Well, no. To get it, you have to sneak up on the End just close enough to hold him up, which requires a great deal of camo cover and a lot of patient, methodical movement. He won't hand it over easily though, and you may have to fire a few warning shots to get him to give it up. And it's worth having incidentally, as it's the only camo in the game with the ability to provide 100% camouflage or complete stealth, as well as some minor photosynthesis. You can still drain his stamina to beat him, but rather than unlock his camo like the other bosses, you will obtain his Moisen Nagant tranquilizer sniper rifle, which is a great prize in and of itself. Doing this requires you to take a slightly different tactic, as you can only use your MK22 tranquilizer pistol, meaning you'll need to get much closer to him, again relying heavily on your thermal goggles and other equipment. If that wasn't enough, there are actually two other ways to take the End out, which don't even involve fighting him. If you save the game and reload it over 8 days later, the End will have died of old age. The other is right after the cutscene where the boss wheels out the End during her interaction with Volgin. If you quickly whip out your sniper rifle, assuming you've already acquired it, and shoot him in the head, you'll kill him then and there, avoiding the fight altogether. If you do this, you'll be ambushed by the Ocelot unit in Sokroveno. However, if you're playing through the game for the first time, in which case, why are you watching this? I highly recommend not taking either of these shortcuts, as it will deprive you of one of the best and most unique moments in gaming history. I think the fact that this fight, more than any other in the series, has so many facets, nuances and alternative methods of completion is very telling about how Kojima and the rest of the team at Konami felt about it. They must have known it was special, and they were right. After beating the End, you ascend a giant ladder to the tune of the Snake Eater theme, sung a cappella. It's another one of those iconic moments associated with this title, and really helps enhance the atmosphere of the game. Considering that the camera is fixed on you during this entire sequence, I want to take a quick moment to talk about the camera. In the original Snake Eater released in 2004, the game had a fixed camera like every other entry in the series. However, given the more dynamic level design, This made traversing certain sections of the game more troublesome compared to the more linear design of Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2. In the 2006 re-release called Subsistence, they added a dynamic camera which could be manually adjusted by the player using the right analog stick. This style of free-form camera is the standard today, but back in 2004, it was still relatively new and revolutionary, thanks to games like Grand Theft Auto 3, which normalised this type of adjustable camera. I just wanted to mention this because I replayed the game using this dynamic camera and wrote this retrospective with this camera in mind. Anyway, after climbing the ladder, we reached the mountain tops above the jungles. This is an entirely different landscape, which is actually easier to sneak through given the fact that the majority of the terrain is the same shade of beige. The game realises this, so it balances the difficulty by making the majority of it completely open air, giving you very few places to find cover. Similarly, it adds new enemies into the mix, including a patrolling helicopter overhead and flamethrower wielding guards. Reaching the peak of the mountain, you rendezvous with Eva, and this is where we really get into the meat of the story. It's during this scene that we see the first moments of intimacy between Eva and Snake, as they compare battle scars and make out for the first time. More importantly, we delve a little deeper into the relationship between Snake and the boss. Although not much is given away, it's revealed that they shared a 10-year relationship, living together, training together, and fighting together. Snake revered her as a mentor and a mother, as well as a lover, suggesting an almost Oedipus-like relationship. Either way, it's clear that the two of them share an inseparable bond, with Snake referring to her as the other half of me. Eva then hands Snake a key which will grant him entrance to Groznygrad through an underground tunnel located in the mountains. When Eva then fecks herself down the mountains on her bike, Snake scopes out the fortress with his binoculars. There, he spots Volgan murdering Granin, ruling him out as a spy, but finding a transmitter on him. This causes tension between him and Ocelot, who laments the death of a comrade. However, the latter's attention is diverted when he spots Eva, redonning her disguise as Sokolov's wife. The boss then shows up and refers to this mysterious philosopher's legacy, which angers Volgan. This whole cutscene is one of the most emotive and revelatory so far, thanks in part to the excellently understated musical score, and really shows both Snake and Eva's vulnerability while building intrigue in the story as a whole. While passing through the underground tunnel, Snake encounters the Fury, the last of the Cobras. A flame-throwing astronaut with a jetpack, the Fury is by far the most difficult boss in the entire game, at least for me. Taking place in a dark area separated into 5 pathways, divided by columns with a deadly drop at the end, the Fury attempts to burn Snake alive, while Snake must attack him either from behind or while he's too far away to be spotted in the dark. The problem is that as the fight goes on, the Fury slowly starts to engulf the battleground in flames. At times, this can be so bad that entire pathways are inaccessible. What's more, the Fury starts to increase his movement speed as the fight goes on, which, on top of his ability to fly through the air and his immunity to his own flames, gives him a huge advantage over Snake in terms of mobility. He also varies his attacks, launching himself down the entire length of corridors like a massive fireball. It's kind of like a mixture of the second Vulcan Raven fight in MGS1 and the Vamp battle in MGS2, combining the increasing pace and space reduction of the former with the overwhelming multi-layering attacks of the latter. This boss is so challenging in fact that while playing through the game on hard mode, I actually gave up on trying to obtain his camouflage, because I just kept dying over and over again while attempting to take him out with the MK22. I wanted it and all, but I also wanted to get this video done at some stage, and life is too short, and well, it was 2 AM and I was drifting off mid-battle, coming to when dying in, ironically, fits of rage. Anyway, as a boss, this is actually the most enjoyable one so far outside of the end. The only issue is that, once again, I have no background information on the guy. This is true of the previous 3 Cobras, but in this case, it feels particularly egregious. First of all, the guy shows up in a fecking spacesuit, and the first words that come out of his mouth are, quote, "I just came back from space," a phrase which, to add insult to injury, mirrors the sentiments of something Eva said to Snake earlier in the game, and something the boss would say to him at the end. He then goes on to tell Snake how he had a vision of the world set ablaze in fury. Again, I sound like a broken record here, but for a game so hyper-focused on story and so gung-ho with the cutscenes, It wouldn't have killed Kojima to dedicate just 5 minutes to each of these characters' backstories. Just a few minutes to get me emotionally invested. I mean, the end I can forgive. And not just because he's my all-time favourite boss, but because his motivation is basic and non-emotive. One more final battle, nothing more. Even his name, The End, is so blunt and stoic that it doesn't really need any detailed exposition. But you can't spend 30 seconds introducing a psychopathic astronaut to me who had visions of the Earth burning in an apparent apocalypse, call him the fecking Fury, and then tell me nothing about him. And after you kill him, do we get a Psycho Mantis-esque monologue where he explains his motivations and atones for his sins? No, he just explodes. After the Fury bursts into flames, we finally make our way to the so-called impenetrable fortress of Groznygrad. As I mentioned before, the game does a really good job of varying up the environments, so after crawling through the deep jungles and mountaintops, we find ourselves for the first time in a large urban environment for a prolonged amount of time. This makes sneaking more challenging as there is no natural cover in these environments. And although you will have accumulated camo and face paint that will somewhat match the sterile concrete around you, in general they are far less effective, and this, along with the fact that you have no radar, makes navigating Groznygrad much more challenging. When you get into the main wing where the Shagohod is located, you can don your scientist disguise again. However, your main goal is to steal the uniform of Ivan Ryakov, a GRU major and second in command to Volgin. Ivan also happens to be identical in appearance to Raiden, the main protagonist from Metal Gear Solid 2. You have to incapacitate him, strip him, steal his outfit, and hide him in a locker. One of the key differences between MGS3 and the first two games is the ambiguity of gameplay direction. In many ways, this is good as it challenges the player to think on their feet to figure out the best course of action to complete a task. All you know is that you have to take him out, but he could be anywhere in the building at any given time. Do you wait for him patiently at the lockers, hoping he'll just so happen to pass through? Do you try to ambush him in the bathroom? Or do you go from room to room, find him, stalk him, wait until you're alone, take him out, and then drag him to the lockers at the risk of being detected? There really is no right or wrong method, and all the game really cares about is that you get the job done. Once you capture him, you put on his uniform and a Raiden mask that you just so happen to have in your possession. I know this makes absolutely no sense, but given the silly and campy nature of this section of the game, it's forgivable if you just go along with the ridiculousness of the whole thing. Donning your disguise, you make your way through the hangar to a room where Sokolov is being held. You make plans to escape, but these are thwarted when Volgin shows up. He says that he had been waiting for you, being Rykov, in his room, and after grabbing your testicles, discovers that you are in fact not Ivan Ryakov at all. For context, MGS3 came out 3 years after MGS2. Now, while opinions on MGS2 and Raiden have become increasingly more positive over the years, and I happen to think MGS2 is the best game of the series, this was still during the height of the MGS2 and Raiden backlash, as many fans not only thought the second game was inferior to the first, but downright hated Raiden, and in many cases, MGS2 as a whole. So the implication throughout this entire section is that Ryakov is Volgin's gay lover, and when you strip him, he's essentially wearing a black thong with, shall we say, very little bulge. Now, I'm not offended by homophobic humour any more than I'm offended by racist or sexist humour, as I think, again given the right context, all of these taboo subjects have a place in comedy. However, these jokes are so on the nose and dense that they really do nothing for me. Essentially, this whole section of the game is designed to shit on Raiden, a character from a game set 50 years in the future with absolutely no ties to the game we're playing. Now, maybe this is purely tongue-in-cheek, with no malice to their previous creation implied. And honestly, it's not a major deal, but I'd be remiss not to acknowledge it, and I feel like they could have just skipped this section altogether. In truth, it just feels like they did this to appease the fans who hated Raiden, which is stupid and, from an artistic vantage point, totally cowardly. Anyway, the boss shows up, kicks the absolute, well, you get it by now, and Snake is taken into captivity. This brings us to the obligatory torture scene, another tradition held over from the previous games. While blindfolded, we hear Volgin murder Sokolov, before he turns his attention to Snake. Taking the blindfold off, Volgin proceeds to beat the crap out of Snake, jolting him with volts of electricity as he interrogates him. Volgin believes that Snake is after the Philosopher's Legacy, which, thanks to Volgin's big mouth, we learn is $100 billion stashed all over the world. Finding a transmitter on him, the boss tells Volgan that she planted it on Snake. Wanting proof that she is not in cahoots with her former protege, Volgan demands that the boss cut out Snake's eyes. Eva prevents this from happening, which causes Ocelot to accuse her of being the spy, prompting him to do his Russian roulette game on her. Snake, seeing a bullet in the chamber, jumps in front of it, which results in him losing an eye. It is also revealed that this is the exact moment that Ocelot developed his torture fetish. On top of this revelation, the boss inexplicably puts a revolver in Snake's belt and tells him to run. It's at this point that an R1 prompt appears, which allows us to briefly see moments and cutscenes through Snake's eyes, or in this instance, eye, revealing the floating ghost of what we can only assume is the Sorrow behind the boss, holding up a codec number. There are many of these prompts throughout the game, which adds an additional interactive layer to the game. When she leaves, Eva is left alone with Snake. She tells him that she has planned an escape route for them in the sewers. After she leaves, Snake is hauled away to a jail cell. Mirroring a similar situation in MGS1, Snake must figure out a way to escape the cell. However, as with the situation with Rykov, the player is given much more autonomy. You can simply use the codec code provided by the ghost earlier on to unlock the cell door, assuming you figured out that that's what it was for. You can intentionally make Snake throw up, prompting a guard check, or you can use the fake death pill, once again prompting the guard check. I want to talk about Easter eggs in more detail later on, but there are two really cool ones here I want to highlight. If you eat the vampire bat in your inventory and then save the game and quit, when you load it, it'll prompt a Devil May Cry / Kingdom Hearts inspired minigame where you slice up monsters with 2 dueling blades. If you throw back the food the guard tosses at you enough times, it'll prompt a cutscene where Snake talks to him. The guard, a jovial fella, turns out to be the father of Johnny, the soldier that Meryl beats up and strips in MGS1. Snake attempts to convince the guard to let him go, but Johnny threatens to shoot him, meaning the player must use one of the other methods to escape. No matter how you go about it, upon escaping, you make your way to the sewers. When you get to the sewers, you receive a call from Eva saying that Volgan has learned of your escape and has guards looking for you. This sets up a tense moment where Snake has to make his way to the sewers, which are a maze of identical ventricles accessible or inaccessible through crawl spaces in the walls. As you try to navigate this area, moving laterally to try to progress forward, more and more dogs start appearing, chasing and attacking you. When you finally find the right uninhibited path, you're met with the blinding glare of sunlight, which you run towards as the sound of footsteps and barking dogs follow you close behind. I wanted to wait until a later moment in the game to talk about the quality of the cutscenes in MGS3, but I really feel it's pertinent to talk about it here. Reaching the edge of a waterfall, Snake is confronted by Ocelot and a group of soldiers. Ocelot attempts his game of roulette on Snake once again, but once again sensing a bullet in the chamber, Snake dives backwards, plummeting what must be hundreds of feet below, in a great homage to the movie The Fugitive. Everything about this scene is so well done, from the aforementioned build-up which creates the tension, to the musical score which segues seamlessly into the cutscene, to the standoff between Snake and Ocelot, to the final slow-motion shot of Snake taking his fate into his own hands, diving into the watery abyss below. Everyone deserves credit here. The sound and music department, the graphics department, the vision and direction of Kojima. It's all well done and, given that this is a 5th generation game released over 20 years ago, is beyond impressive. I'll talk about the cinematics in general in a little bit more detail later, but I felt the need to mention it here. Floating down the river unconscious, we encounter our next boss battle, the Sorrow. Now, it's true that we had killed all the Cobras when we immolated the Fury, but we don't need to kill the Sorrow because he's already dead. We find out right after this encounter that the boss killed the Sorrow herself when they found themselves on opposite ends of the battlefield. Their relationship, like that between Snake and the boss, is deep, but we won't go into it here. In truth, we don't really need to because, unlike the other Cobras, the Sorrow's battle emotion is established well enough to set the appropriate tone. Standing in a river with the Sorrow hovering above and ahead of him, all Snake has to do is wade through the river. That's it. The Sorrow launches these wavy telekinetic attacks at Snake, but these are all non-lethal and just cause Snake to collapse temporarily. Aside from this, all Snake has to do is keep moving forward. However, as you do, you'll encounter the ghosts of every soldier you killed during the game. If you didn't kill any, you'll wade through a mostly empty river. However, you will encounter all the members of the Cobra unit, whether you took them out lethally or not. This is actually one of my favourite bosses in the game. Sure, there's no offense, and you cannot die, but atmospherically it really hits the mark. Also, as I mentioned, this is the first time the game really nailed the emotion of one of the Cobras, as the sorrow sadness permeates throughout with his low, melancholy voice, lamenting the loss of life on the battlefield, driving the point of the pain and brutality of war home, a point that was very pertinent in the previous entries of the series. Aside from his ability to communicate with the dead, the Sorrow can also look into the future, saying that Snake will be killed by his sons, a clue which, if you hadn't figured out who Naked Snake is by now, surely gave it away. Incidentally, I believe this is the moment that 13-year-old me figured it out. I don't know what that says about my level of intelligence then or now. When you reach the end of this, quote, boss, you walk into the Sorrow and collapse dead. This prompts the game over screen, and probably a great deal of confusion for many players. I think I replayed this boss about a dozen times back in 2004 before I realised that you had to go into the side menu and take out the revival pill. Once you do, Snake awakes underwater and after a degree of struggle, manages to make it back to shore, having barely cheated death. This triggers a quick flashback cutscene where the Sorrow tells the boss that she has to kill him, which puts a nice emotional bookend on the encounter. Up ahead, Snake rendezvous with Eva in a cave behind a waterfall where they engage in some softcore, half-naked shenanigans. More importantly, Eva gives Snake some C3, a moldable explosive that he can use to blow up the Shagohod and Granin's research facility. There's also a moment where Snake is unable to catch a butterfly, signifying his now impaired vision. Incidentally, now when you fire your gun at an enemy, you have to aim it slightly off-center to compensate for his loss of sight in his right eye, which is a nice attention to detail. Making your way back to Groznygrad, Snake sneaks into the warehouse housing the Shagohod and plants the C3 on the fuel tanks with the intention of blowing the entire facility sky high. This is another one of those fun stealthy moments, with Snake having to methodically navigate the relatively exposed warehouse, maximising the use of careful movement and camouflage. After placing the C3, Snake is, unsurprisingly, confronted again by Ocelot, the boss and Volgan, who has Eva laying at his feet. The boss once again beats Snake up, believe it or not, and Volgan reveals that he caught Eva with the microfilm containing the information on the Philosopher's Legacy, revealing her as the spy. Volgan then explains what the Philosopher's Legacy is to Snake. Basically, the Philosopher's Legacy was a massive sum of money pooled together by the three major allied powers of World War II, the US, China, and the Soviet Union. This fortune of $100 billion, over $1 trillion today when adjusted for inflation, was used to fund atomic weapon technology and steal away Nazi scientists, among other research, development, and general expenditures of war, which helped the Allies win the Great War. It also led to the formation of the Cobras and the development of the Shagohod. Volgan's father, another group commander, was one of the main men in charge of protecting the legacy. However, through money laundering and the use of a multitude of secret bank accounts all over the world, he managed to secure the legacy, keeping it in Soviet hands. Inheriting the legacy, Volgan plans to use it to complete the development of the Shagohod and establish Russian supremacy around the world. By now, it's clear that the game wears its influences of old spy novels and movies on its sleeve. But what is also apparent is how relatively straightforward the story is. After the esoteric, convoluted and, quite frankly, challenging plot of MGS2, it was refreshing to be given a straightforward storyline to follow. I'm not saying that it's better or worse, but as with the changes in presentation and gameplay, it makes for a nice departure and helps Metal Gear Solid 3 stand out within the series as a whole. It's also convenient that the very first game in the Metal Gear timeline is easy to understand and follow, because it is the foundation of the entire overarching Metal Gear story, the genesis if you will. This, to me, makes Metal Gear Solid 3 the most accessible game in the entire series. Sure, the gameplay is more challenging and methodical, but the adventure itself is very straightforward, and cruises along at a pace comparable to the espionage thrillers it's modelled after, giving this game, more so than any other in the series, the feeling of playing through a long interactive movie which, given Kojima's reverence for the film industry, an industry which, by his own admission, he would have preferred to have been involved in, is perhaps the biggest compliment you could possibly pay the series, and its creator. Ocelot, once again, wants to test Snake's luck, but is cut off by Volgin, who wants to kill Snake himself. This causes Ocelot to point a gun at both Snake and Volgin, showing a rift between commander and subordinate. However, Volgin gets his wish, and, lowering the platform of the warehouse into a makeshift fight pit, faces off against the player, with Ocelot observing from above. My only major issue with the boss fight is the environment itself. I don't know why, but the aforementioned makeshift pit just kind of takes me out of it a little bit. I understand they designed it this way to contain the fight, but after the environmental freedom of the last 3 boss fights, the sorrow of course notwithstanding, it just feels a bit conspicuous and arbitrary, and I feel like they could have utilised the warehouse environment more effectively. Aside from that, the boss itself is good. As per the explosives planted by Snake himself, the fight is timed, meaning Snake must defeat Volgin within a certain amount of time, or fail the mission entirely. The premise of the fight is simple enough. Volgin, who is protected by a magnetic force field, shoots bolts of electricity and bullets at you, which you have to dodge. Again, the defensive tactics are basic enough. You simply have to avoid Volgin's attacks by running from them. However, the game has a way of adding a layer of complexity to this. If you have a gun equipped, you'll be unable to avoid his bolt attacks as they'll conduct the electricity, burning you and sending ammo flying. Similarly, if you try to avoid his gunfire in close range, he'll hit you 9 times out of 10, forcing you to create distance. As I mentioned, Volgin has a force field protecting his anterior, meaning you have to attack him from behind. This means you have to maneuver your way to his side or his back, or wait until he has to recharge his electricity to shoot him from behind. Volgin will also charge you with melee attacks, which gives you a window of opportunity when he's not charged up with electricity, not only to shoot him, but to attack him with CQC. As the boss wears on, Volgin will vary up his electric attacks. Instead of just shooting one straight bolt at you, he'll fire 2-pronged forks of electricity at you, or, most challenging of all, he'll ignite the floor with multiple electrical charges which will move in different directions, making them particularly challenging to avoid. After defeating Volgin, you flee the warehouse, rendezvousing with Eva on her motorcycle. However, Volgin, still kicking, emerges from the exploding building in the Shagohod, setting up a chase sequence through Groznygrad. I briefly mentioned the quality of the cutscenes earlier on, but I really want to focus on it here. Everything during this sequence, from the voice acting to the cinematography, to the choreography, to the orchestrated score, is phenomenal. Sure, the graphics have aged in the same way that all graphics from all generations do, but in all seriousness, there are a few games out there today in 2025 that could rival Metal Gear Solid 3 in terms of cinematic presentation. The 3-way cat and mouse between Snake and Eva, Ocelot and Volgin is tremendous, with the entire facility just crumbling around them. Interspersed between these excellent cutscenes is some on-the-rails drive-by shooting. With Eva manning the bike, Snake has to clear the path of soldiers while riding shotgun. Now, I don't want to be too hard on this section from a gameplay perspective, as it's the first time in the series, aside from the Liquid Snake chase sequence at the end of MGS1, which in terms of scope almost doesn't even count, that they attempted something like this. However, I have 2 minor gripes with it. The first is the fact that some of these roadblocks are kind of pointless. What I mean by this is, yeah, there are sections where a group of soldiers are standing in the middle of your pathway, but logically it would be easier for Eva to just drive through them while Snake sprays them with bullets, rather than just stalling there like sitting ducks, waiting for Snake to pick them off one by one. I understand that the game wants to encourage you to still somewhat methodically kill the enemy soldiers, but I feel like they could have accomplished this by putting more impenetrable roadblocks in your way, which would have actually forced you to eliminate them. The second minor issue is the use of unlimited ammo. During the motorcycle sections, every weapon in your arsenal is temporarily given unlimited ammo. This by itself isn't a problem because, while unrealistic, it isn't viable to have the player jump off the motorcycle mid-chase to scavenge for ammo should you run out, as this would just destroy the momentum of the set piece. The problem is that when you snap in and out of a selected weapon, it automatically reloads. While not particularly egregious when using, say, an AK-47, it's absolutely galling when firing an RPG, as instead of having to manually place another rocket in the launcher, which can take about 6 seconds or so, you can just quickly tap R2 and have a fresh rocket ready to go in a split second. Again, it's far from a game ruiner, it just makes it a little too easy when you figure it out. The chase sequence reaches its climax when you lure the Shagohod over a bridge which is rigged with explosives, leading to a full sequence where Snake must shoot all the detonators on the bridge while the tank is crossing it. Of course, this isn't the end, and scaling the cliff edge like some kind of zombie parkour weapon of mass destruction, it's time for the final showdown with the Shagohod and with Volgan. The fight starts out with you still riding Bitch on Eva's motorcycle as she circles around the Shagohod. To deter the tank's firepower, you have to stop it from moving by shooting its treads with your RPG and then attacking the vulnerable weak spot at the back of the vehicle when it's stationary, again with the RPG. Damage it enough and Volgan would emerge from the tank, leaving him vulnerable to attacks. At this point, Snake and Eva will split up, with Eva using herself as a decoy to allow Snake to attack. The game does a nice job here of ramping up the difficulty by making the player go on foot here, as it makes Volgan, who is already a much smaller target than the Shagohod, much more difficult to hit. It also makes Snake much more vulnerable to the Shagohod's attacks, with its payload of machine gun fire and missiles much harder to evade. It all makes for a very nice crescendo and a fitting end to both Volgan and the Shagohod itself, and is, if nothing else, the most epic and bombastic fight in the entire game. After you beat the Shagohod and share another kiss with Eva, ensuring that Snake's balls are blue enough to induce heart failure, you find yourself being pursued once again by enemy soldiers. Why they're still pursuing you now after Volgan, the Shagohod and Groznygrad have all been obliterated is anybody's guess. Perhaps it's out of a pure sense of duty, I'm not sure. Either way, it triggers our final vehicular chase sequence, so no complaints here. This one is a little different because it takes place in the jungles and is purely about escaping the enemy. Of course, you have to engage them, but there is no stopping this time as you careen downhill through the trees and bushes, leaving the ground for the occasional action movie-esque cliff jump. The first chase sequence is far superior from a cinematic standpoint, but from a pure gameplay perspective, I find this chase more enjoyable than the first, as the idea of firing at the enemies to keep them at bay while constantly trying to outrun them just makes more sense to me. The jungle environment also makes hitting your targets more enjoyable, and is a nice callback to the beginning of the game, bringing everything together full circle before the conclusion of Snake Eater's final act. The chase ends in disaster, however, as Snake and Eva go careening off a cliff. Relatively unscathed, Snake finds Eva much worse for wear, as she's been impaled through the abdomen by a tree branch. This sets up an escort mission to the lake where Eva has a Whig aircraft ready for their escape and where the boss is waiting for Snake. Escort missions get a bad rap in gaming because they're seen as a nuisance that show the ineptitude of the friendly NPCs who oftentimes fail to follow direction and just do random idiotic things that either get them or the player killed. This section has all of these hallmarks. For one, Eva is badly injured and depleted, meaning she needs to eat every few minutes or will simply refuse to move. What's more, she will not act on her own, meaning Snake must guide her completely to walk, kneel and crawl. A point which is hilariously and fourth wall shatteringly mentioned by Major Zero when he says that Eva will literally follow Snake off a cliff. The only action Eva will take by herself is to fire upon enemy soldiers if they're spotted. But by that point it's too late, as moving and progressing through the jungle, especially on higher difficulties, is nigh on impossible while under alert. All that being said, I actually really enjoyed this section. For one, the moment when you realise that the gang of enemy soldiers are pursuing you after finding the wreckage of your motorcycle is the most tense moment in the entire game, and more so than any other moment in the game, makes you feel like you're the one being hunted. Having to coax Eva into cover while evading or stealthily taking out enemy soldiers also ramps up that feeling of survival. You have to be perfect. You can't just run off if you're spotted because Eva will be picked off if you do. And soldiers will just keep coming at you if you attempt to engage them in a straight up gunfight. When you reach the very end of the jungle, there is an enemy ambush waiting for you, with soldiers hiding in camouflage in the tall grass and behind cover, an almost ironic homage to Snake himself. When you make it through this final section with Eva still breathing, it really feels like you've conquered the stealth concept because, as I mentioned, you have to be perfect. Aside from all this, I like this section because, much like the motorcycle chase sequence, it only occurs once in the entire game, reinforcing the variety and masterful pacing that this game maintains throughout most of its duration. As was becoming tradition for the series up until this point, this game is full of Easter eggs. I want to go over some of the ones we haven't covered so far before we get to the boss. Blow up any food storage houses you come across with TNT, and the next time you enter that area, the guards will be hungry. They will also eat any poison or rotten food you throw at them. You can also plant TNT on a soldier's back. I already mentioned that you will be given R1 prompts throughout the game to view certain scenes through Snake's eyes. However, there are also a number of hidden unprompted first-person cutscene moments. During the upcoming battle with the boss, you can capture 3 unique snakes: Solid, Liquid, and Solidus. Using the controller, you can change and manipulate the CQC menu screen, such as speeding up and down the animation and changing the camo colours. You can also use the controller in a similar fashion during the Snake Eater pre-menu intro. You can make Snake or Eva throw up by rotating their avatars violently in the cure menu. Call Sigint after your nightmare in the cell and he'll tell you of his own particularly disgusting nightmare. When you're disguised as Rykov at the Groznygrad weapons wing, you can attack guards and scientists with impunity. And finally, there are a number of secret codecs that you can call to heal you, drop bombs on enemies, and have alerts called off. Many of these can be revealed when you hold up guards at knife point. Reaching the lake with Eva, who's surprisingly mobile given her recent impaling, she runs off to prepare the wig while you confront the boss, who's waiting for you in a field of white flowers. Before your final fight, the boss reiterates her mantra about how enemies and war change with the political times. She begs the question as to whether the US and Russia will be enemies in the 21st century, saying she doubts it. A clever use of then modern hindsight to make the boss seem extra wise, but a statement which may not end up aging well depending on how the next few years of geopolitics plays out. She also tells Snake that she did not train him with the purpose of having to fight him, as these skills are not meant to be used to hurt friends. She reveals that she was chosen by the US government to be sent into space in 1960. While in space, she says she saw the ideal vision of the Earth, understanding that the space race, along with other economic, military and scientific advances, is just another competition between the US in the West and the Soviet Union in the East. Elaborating on this, she reveals that the philosophers are a shadow group intended on keeping the war economy and the technological race between East and West alive, in a perpetual repetitive cycle. She also reveals that she is the last surviving child of the philosophers, and that her father, a member, was murdered by the group. He was killed for explaining to his daughter the treacherous nature of the philosophers. She also reveals that both her and Snake were made infertile due to radiation poisoning. This may seem like a minor detail in isolation, but one of the biggest themes of the entire series is the passing on of one's genes, and the inability of all the characters connected to the boss and Big Boss to reproduce. It's a theme that ties in more closely with and is more prominent in MGS 1 and 2, and it's a little strange to just shoehorn it in here at the end. Again, as I mentioned, the story in MGS 3 is great, and its simplicity is not a detriment. It actually gives it some autonomy from the others from a narrative perspective. It's just unfortunate that some of the themes and threads aren't fleshed out more or, at times, just feel a little forced. The boss did have a child at one point though, and with the sorrow no less. Luckily, the very end of the game would make up for these somewhat forced revelations, giving us a much more fleshed out and satisfying end. However, before we get there, we must eliminate the boss. The fight with the boss is great and one of the most enjoyable in the game from a gameplay perspective. And although, once again, it's not as good as the end, narratively and emotionally, it is by far the best. Snake must use his cunning to camouflage among the bed of white flowers to ambush the boss with gunfire while avoiding her own, fleeing between exchanges to new cover to hide once again before re-engaging. Sporadically, the boss, upon discovering Snake, will run at him and hit him with CQC, giving him prior warning beforehand. If you time it just right, you can counter these moves by pressing the circle button, giving you time to attack the stunned boss with some CQC of your own, which shall complement like a good mentor. And it's just as well as you do, as these throws and trips eat up a significant chunk of your health bar, more than even a round of bullets. But given the narrative significance of CQC throughout the game, it makes sense, if just from a metaphorical standpoint. I wanted to wait until this point of the video to do an analysis on CQC. Now, as I mentioned, The CQC system is a huge part of Metal Gear Solid 3 from a narrative standpoint. It's used to incapacitate multiple enemies in cutscenes, including Vulcan and Ocelot, the latter of which is so enamoured by it that he goes on to learn it. It's referenced multiple times throughout the game, and is not only the foundation of the boss and Snake's relationship, at least from a training perspective, but is the sole factor in Snake's inability to defeat the boss up until this point, which is the primary mission objective and the main focal point of the entire story. With this in mind, when implemented in the gameplay, it can feel a little underdeveloped. Don't get me wrong, the ability to run up to an enemy and throw them, holding them up at knife point to then either throw them, hold a knife to their throat for information, or use them as a human shield is cool, and was completely ahead of its time back in 2004. If CQC had just been an element of the gameplay and nothing more, I'd have no issue with it. But considering it's such a critical part of the story, including this final showdown with the boss, and how many different throws and techniques we see Snake use in the cutscenes throughout the game, it would have been nice to have had the ability to execute more trips and throws than the one basic slam we're allowed to perform. When we defeat the boss, she gives Snake the Philosopher's Legacy and her gun, which is called the Patriot, and tells Snake that there is only room for one boss and one Snake. She then orders Snake to kill her, a moment made all the more personal when the game temporarily ceases the cutscene, forcing the player to physically pull the trigger. Like so many other moments in the game, it's brilliantly done, and is by far the most emotional moment the series had produced up until that point, made all the more affecting by the excellent cinematography and phenomenal musical score. But, to borrow a phrase from Metal Gear Solid 1, the best, or perhaps the worst, is yet to come. Snake rendezvous with Eva as they prepare to flee in the Wig. As they attempt their takeoff in the lake, Revolver Ocelot shows up once again, this time manning one of those hovercrafts, and breaks his way into the MiG for one final showdown with Snake, after showing off some CQC of his own. He places two revolvers on the floor and, in a cool moment, the player actually gets to pick which gun they want to use to duel. What's even cooler, since only one of the guns is loaded, whatever one you pick will directly affect the outcome of the duel. Not that it matters, because the lone bullet is a blank, meaning the entire thing was just a test of grit all along. Ocelot tells Snake that his name is Adamska, before asking for his, to which Snake falsely replies John. They shake hands, and Adamska jumps from the Wig, which just about manages to clear a mountain range directly in front of them. Snake and Eva are briefly chased by Russian fighter jets, before they're called off by Khrushchev as a favour to Snake, Zero, and America, once again right in the nick of time before both of them would have been shot down. This concludes the action portion of the game, and what a roller coaster it was. The final cutscene begins with Snake and Eva drinking wine together on a bear rug in a plush cottage in the woods of Alaska. They make love, but upon waking, Snake finds that Eva is gone. In her wake, she leaves a tape recording for Snake, who, lighting a cigar, sits down to listen to it. In the recording, Eva reveals that she was never an American NSA codebreaker who defected to the Soviet Union. Instead, she was a sleeper agent for the Chinese government, who was trained in a philosopher-run academy from an early age. Her job was to aid Snake and the CIA in their mission, but to secure the legacy for China. After achieving this goal and stealing the legacy from Snake, she is supposed to kill him. However, she finds herself unable to do this. The reason for this isn't her love for Snake, or her own sense of morality. It's because she made a promise to the boss. A promise to tell Snake the truth. When Snake was sent covertly into the Soviet Union by the CIA and Fox, he had three main objectives: retrieve Sokolov, destroy the Shagohod, and assassinate the boss. The reason? To re-grant Sokolov American asylum, take out the Soviets' newest nuclear weapon, and if possible, Vulcan as well, and to eliminate the treasonous boss to prove the US was not involved in the nuking of the research facility, with the final objective being of the utmost importance. However, what Snake didn't know is that the boss was given an order from the CIA to defect as a double agent, to infiltrate the Cobras and the Soviet Union so she could secure the Philosopher's Legacy for the United States. However, after Vulcan nuked the facility, the boss's orders changed, and she now had to lay down her life to Snake in order to clear America's name and secure the Philosopher's legacy for Snake, which she hands him at the end of their fight. The same legacy that Eva stole for herself. As Eva's words ring in our ears, we cut to Snake being honoured by President Johnson, surrounded by members of the CIA and his support team, Major Zero, SIGINT, and Paramedic. He is also given the title of Big Boss, which, if you hadn't figured it out by now, means that Naked Snake is, of course, the legendary soldier Big Boss, the founder of Foxhound and the genetic basis for the Les Enfants Terribles project, the product of which created Solid, Liquid, and Solid as Snake, genetic clones of Big Boss, the perfect agent and soldier. Solid Snake and Big Boss would, of course, go on to have a long adversarial relationship over the course of many decades through the Metal Gear timeline. Receiving the honour, Snake walks out of the room, refusing to shake hands with the director of the CIA or to even acknowledge his support team, feeling betrayed. We then cut to Snake walking up to the boss's unmarked grave at Arlington Cemetery, where Snake lays down her Patriot gun at her grave. As he does this, Eva's voiceover reinforces the sacrifice the boss made. She tells Snake that no one will know the truth of what she did, how the history books will revile her as a traitor, and, as she honours the boss as the true American patriot that she is, Snake stands tall and salutes her grave, with a single tear rolling down his cheek from his one remaining eye. This is one of the most iconic and emotional moments in the entire series, if not the most iconic and emotional, and puts a brilliant exclamation point on an exceptional story. During the credits scene, it is revealed that the CIA used the money from the Philosopher's legacy to re-establish the Philosophers, but under the new name of the Patriots, and that in spite of Zero disbanding Fox, Big Boss reformed it under the name Foxhound. These are two huge revelations, as the Patriots and Foxhound are the two most important groups in the entire series. I could spend another hour talking about both of these groups, however this video is long enough as it is. Needless to say, the formation of Foxhound, the Patriots, and the completion of the Les Enfants Terribles project are the three defining moments in the series that would prove to be the causation of every major event that would take place throughout the entire alternative history of Metal Gear Solid. And here, right here, we see the genesis of it all. Not done yet, we're privy to a final post-credit sequence, another Metal Gear tradition. In it, we hear Ocelot talking with the director of the CIA. It turns out that Ocelot was working with the CIA all along, and was in fact Adam, the other alleged NSA codebreaker who never showed up when Eva did, and just as well because she was supposed to kill him. He also tells the director that the copy of the legacy that Eva has was a fake, and that he secured the real legacy for America. He also informs him that he uncovered the blueprints for the Metal Gear prototype that Granin was working on, saying that it could come in handy someday. Which of course they would, given that these are the blueprints that would go on to become, of course, the first Metal Gear. Far from the juvenile Ocelot we were exposed to throughout the duration of the game, this is the Ocelot we all know. Cunning, deceitful, incredibly intelligent, and perhaps the most singularly core character in the entire franchise. Hanging up the phone, we hear those 007 inspired ending chords as the screen fades to black. Metal Gear Solid 1 saw the first true fruition of Hideo Kojima's vision for what the series should be, in terms of gameplay, presentation, and story. Metal Gear Solid 2 saw him go as far down the Metal Gear lore rabbit hole as viably possible, pushing the series to its limits in terms of narrative complexity, while setting an industry standard in terms of presentation and innovative gameplay. Metal Gear Solid 4, which I will hopefully cover one day, saw Kojima tie up an inconceivably vast ball of narrative loose ends, attempting to force shut half a century's worth of alternative history in as cohesive a manner as humanly possible, while expanding the parameters of the series' already extensive gameplay mechanics as far as it could. In many ways, Metal Gear Solid 3 is a simplistic masterpiece by comparison. The origin of the most extensive, convoluted and intense storyline in video game history is simply one of espionage and betrayal. A story of a young soldier who must defeat his mentor for duty and country, while attempting to maintain peace in an already precarious Cold War. A tale of a deranged antagonist attempting to establish world domination using a new superweapon. A yarn of two soldiers of espionage entangled in a love story and, ultimately, a tragedy of betrayal. A man who killed his mentor by his own hand at the behest of the government, and then uncovering the horrible truth that she was in fact not a traitor at all, but the greatest patriot his country would ever know. Even the gameplay elements, which are mechanically more complex in execution, have their origins in historical and environmental simplicity. A man on a mission who must do so with primitive technology, forced to sneak through the jungles and the harshest terrain, surviving on instinct, skill, and the flesh of the animals around him, while encountering some of the finest bosses the medium has ever known. In that sense, it's fitting that the game in the series with arguably the finest pacing and atmosphere, and inarguably the most emotional story and best one-on-one encounters, is the easiest to play, follow, and indeed, feel.